Hey class, this is Dr. Schramek. I am recording this video because we did not have class today, and I want to make sure that you guys have an opportunity to get some lecture from me about the brain and the nervous system. So I'll be picking up where we left off on Wednesday of last week and just carrying the lecture forward through the end of the slideshows that I have available to you for the brain and nervous system chapter. So just to kind of give you a brief overview of what we're going to be covering, we'll be talking about the nervous system from an evolutionary perspective, then from a developmental perspective, and merging those two ideas so that we can talk about the structure of the brain itself, and then the different components that the brain is made up of, as well as what those different parts are responsible for, so both structure and function. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to see if I can share my screen too and give you the lowdown here. Hopefully it'll be relatively quick. Okay, so let me start off with this first part. So we're really going to think about the nervous system from from an evolutionary perspective here. And the main idea is that we're similar, evolutionarily speaking, to lower animals. And it's important to consider this. So we can see this with the same structure that we have when comparing human embryos to other species. So you can see here we have uh, fish, salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, calf, rabbit, and human embryos. And early on in the embryonic period, they're very similar in their structure. And then you can see that as they continue to grow, their trajectories begin to change, and then they form quite different creatures. But we have some very similar beginnings, and that really kind of is shared, especially with our nervous systems. So from an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense to think about how we share similar regions with what we would think of as lower animals, meaning that they're not as complex. That's a very human-centric perspective on the animal kingdom, but nonetheless, that's how we think about it. So there are areas of the brain that we think of as being older, meaning that they have been around, evolutionarily speaking, for a longer period of time than what we consider to be the kind of latest and greatest human parts of the brain. So in particular, there's this triune model. It is not represented in the chapter, but it is a very prestigious old model that's been around for quite some time. It was created by Paul MacLean, who graduated from Yale Medical School in 1940. He was also the head of the National Institutes of Mental Health for a period of time. And you do not need to memorize this model. This is really just to provide context so that you kind of have an idea about what we mean whenever we think about older versus newer parts of the brain. So whenever we're thinking about the brain, the reptilian brain, we kind of really think of as being the brain stem in particular, and perhaps the cerebellum. So they're really kind of like lower, older parts of the brain that we share with cold-blooded animals like reptiles. Beyond that, we can kind of think about the structures that sit on top of the brainstem, which we associate with the limbic system, and they're thought of as being mammalian. If you think about orcas, I don't know if anybody saw the documentary Blackfish, but orcas actually have quite developed limbic systems, and it's part of why we understand them to be very much bonded to their family system. So they're to their young and other orcas that are a part of their pods. So that bonding, that emotion center is really kind of in the limbic system. It's considered mammalian. And then beyond that, we have that part of the brain that I really wanted to hit home on, which is that the cortex, which sits way on top. It's that wrinkly part, and it does make us quite different from lower creatures from an evolutionary perspective. So we can also think about these structures in terms of a developmental perspective. So not just across millennia, whenever we're looking at all different kinds of creatures and how they have evolved over time and how we share common ancestors with them, but also in terms of just what happens whenever we're forming in the womb and how we develop across that period of time while we're in the womb. The gestational period is what that's called. And then as we continue to grow old. So at the very beginning, we have what's called a neural tube. And the neural tube begins to bend and fold in specific places that will then be considered parts of the brain in terms of this developmental perspective. So you can see here, as early as 4 weeks, we have what will eventually become the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain, and how that will demonstrate itself in the full grown brain. And you'll also notice how foldy this top layer is. See how smooth it is at 3 months. But then by the time we get to 6 months, that cortex, that top layer, becomes quite folded. And then that complexity or the folds continue to um, to increase as development continues. So, so that's a little bit about the developmental perspective. In terms of the actual parts of the brain, these are, again, not for you to memorize, but if you are interested in the actual biological terms for these parts of the brains, they are here listed for you, so you can use that as a reference, in particular if you are going to continue with taking more biology courses. But nonetheless, I just wanted to show that to you. So we have the spinal cord, and then we have the hindbrain, which sits atop of that. And then we have the midbrain, which is actually a quite small region of the brain. And then we have the forebrain, which makes up the largest part of the brain. And we'll see that in the next image as well. So here we have that neural tube at 5 weeks, and then at 13 weeks, you can see how those folds begin to turn into larger regions. And then we have the continued growth, in particular of the forebrain and the hindbrain. The midbrain in particular is quite small. You can kind of see that over here at birth. The midbrain is quite tiny. It's just the small section between the forebrain, which includes all of the cortex, so that wrinkly layer on top, and then the subcortical regions, which we'll learn as the limbic system. That's all the forebrain, and then there's a tiny section that's the midbrain, and then the hindbrain is really the brain stem, this green region, and the cerebellum, which is that kind of pinky red small brain that sits in the back. All right. So these are the macro level brain regions that we understand from a developmental perspective. So we have the cerebrum, which includes the cortex. And then underneath it, we have the subcortical region, which is the limbic system, and then the cerebellum here in the back and the brainstem. Those make up the hindbrain. And remember that midbrain is quite small and it's in between. From an evolutionary perspective, again, the cerebellum and the brainstem are older regions, and the cortex in particular is considered to be a newer region, the most recent addition being the prefrontal cortex. And then if we were to break the brainstem down further into subcomponents, you can see here in particular how small that midbrain really is. So it really is just this small region right at the top of the brainstem. And then below that, we have this bulbous region called the pons. And then below that, we have the medulla, also known as the medulla oblongata, because it's oblong. It's kind of an oblong shape. In particular, what the brainstem is responsible for is a lot of automatic functions. So we learned about the autonomic nervous system. So a lot of that is governed in the brainstem. So things that we don't do on purpose that our body kind of handles for us, things like breathing, heart rate, digestion, sneezing, coughing, vomiting, your sleep-wake cycle. So you wanting to and falling asleep and then being awake during parts of the day. That is regulated as well as things like your body temperature and your balance. Those are all handled by the brainstem. Um, and actually the cerebellum in particular is responsible for coordination and posture and balance. So we have that as well. All right, so moving on to the next part of this presentation, we're going to do a little bit of review and just to make sure everybody kind of remembers everything, to kind of test yourself, and then we'll move on to some more details, in particular regarding the cortex. We kind of reviewed the hindbrain there, talking about the brainstem and the cerebellum and what their functions are, a lot of those automatic functions. But really in this part, we're going to delve a lot more deeper into the cortex. So how is it that we're different from lower animals? Remember that we share very similar nervous system structure with them. We can see that in particular with the embryonic development. But in particular, this cortex that we keep focusing on is something that we think of as being something that differentiates us from lower creatures. So if you look at the brains of these different um, species up top, we've got a mouse, which has a pretty smooth cortex. And then we've got a cat, which has a bit more complexity. There's a bit more folds in the cortex there. And then we have the dog, a little bit more complex. The rhesus monkey, which is also a monkey, but not quite as genetically similar as a chimpanzee. Remember, chimpanzees share upwards of 95% of their genetic material with humans, and you can see that their brain structure is strikingly similar to humans. And across millions of years or millennia, we can see our non-human primate ancestors and how we began to separate from uh, these non-human primates and become human species. In particular, what begins to differentiate us are things that require abstraction and additional complexity, especially the amount of time that we are allowed to spend socially. So the abundance of food in particular, which arises from agriculture, and then the formation of cities and art, the use of fire, which actually preceded that. All these kind of increase our brain volume, and that's also part of what we attribute to the folds in the cortex, is that we have the increase of the brain volume, but the skull itself remains relatively similar in size. But in order to increase the surface area, the folds begin to form and increase in number. All right, so that cortex, terribly important to how we differentiate ourselves from lower creatures, if you will. So to remind us here, we have, remember that cerebrum, that's another word that we have for the cortex, or that top layer, it's the whole area there. Of course, we have two lobes. We have the, or hemispheres, I should say, not lobes, hemispheres. We have the left and the right hemisphere. We will talk about some ways that those are different. And then underneath that, we have the hindbrain. So we have the brainstem and the cerebellum. So we're really going to focus on the forebrain here. Remember, the forebrain both includes the cerebrum, which is the cortex, and then underneath the cortex, we have subcortical regions, largely known as the limbic system, which we will be focusing on. But mostly from the developmental perspective, you're going to want to focus on, and you do want to remember these: forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. So the cortex is quite foldy. I keep remembering to explain how important the cortex is and how that differentiates us from lower creatures. But these folds are not unique. They are actually common across people. So we have similar folds. My folds look like your folds. Your folds look like your neighbor's folds. And there are names for these folds. So we've got sulci for the grooves and gyri for the bumps. That's whenever they're plural, if you're talking about one particular spot. So one fold might be called a gyrus, one particular uh, I'm sorry, and I messed that up. The bump or the top part is the gyrus. The valley, if you will, or that groove is the sulcus. So sulcus singular, gyrus singular, sulci is plural, gyri is plural. And then remember, cortical is what we call the cortex in an adjective form. So if I'm saying subcortical regions, we're talking about below the cortex. All right, so in terms of the actual cortex itself, we do have, I say, four-ish lobes. The reason why it's four-ish is because two of them have the same name because they're on different sides of your head. So there's the right and left temporal lobes. But beyond that, we only have three more. So we have the frontal lobe, which is quite large, and then the occipital lobe way in the back. And between the occipital and the frontal, we have the parietal lobe. And we've already gone over this a little bit in class, so you should remember some of these things. In terms of the frontal lobe, this is really what kind of makes us in particular quite different from lower creatures. Because the frontal lobe is so responsible for things that we consider to be higher order thinking or doing things that we exert a lot of control over that perhaps animals might not be able to exert as much control over. So exerting control over emotions. So things like emotion regulation, regulating your emotions is controlling your emotions. So if you're having difficulty in a particular moment with something that's making you angry or anxious or aroused in some way, then you exerting control over that is a form of emotion regulation or exerting control over the emotion. We can also think about control over information. That can take the form of planning. So you thinking about what you're going to do and how you're going to arrange that information, how you're going to arrange those plans. Decision making, problem solving, this is all exerting control over information. And you're doing that in your frontal lobe. And then there's also control over your body. So the movement control, all of that is happening from the frontal lobe. So it's really everything that you associate with the self in particular, things that you do where you feel like you're in control, that's happening from the frontal lobe. So let's look at an old example here. We have Phineas Gage. This is one of the most famous stories of a frontal lobe injury. He endured a railway worker accident in 1848 where a metal rod went through his left eye socket and came out of his skull. So you can see this image here where I guess his eye was open whenever this occurred. And so he lost his eyeball, but his eyelid is still in place. And of course, his hair grew back. But even though he survived, he ended up experiencing quite a few changes in his personality. So before the injury, he was known as being quite responsible and hardworking. But then after the injury, he became disrespectful, foul-mouthed, and he also had trouble carrying out plans. So if you think about this, how does this demonstrate what we know and understand about the frontal lobe? So I ask you guys to consider that, and we'll kind of talk about it on Wednesday whenever we meet up. All right, and then for the frontal lobe, we have some additional things. We not only exert executive control over information, like planning, or over our emotions, we also have the actual control of our body. So in the frontal lobe, at the very, very back, right before you get to the parietal lobe, we have this strip that's called the primary motor cortex. And it's really a map of the human body. So we have a space in the brain, in that primary motor cortex, that's actually allocated toward a particular region of the body. That's like the control panel. It's where your brain is exerting control over a particular part of the body. And right behind that strip is this specific groove. Remember, we said that we have similar grooves, right? So everybody has this one. It's called the central sulcus, and it's really the dividing line between the frontal lobe and what's right behind it, which is the parietal lobe. All right, and so if we think about the primary motor cortex, it makes sense because you're exerting control, right? So it's voluntary, you're doing it on purpose. So voluntary motor movement all happening right there in that primary motor cortex. So if you think about where Lisa Simpson is exerting that control over her voluntary motor movement, where might that be happening? It would be happening in her primary motor cortex in the very rear of the frontal lobe, right before you get to the parietal lobe. And remember that division line is the central sulcus. All right, so if you were creating a brain and you wanted to put the command center for all of the muscles in the body in a particular region, like the primary motor cortex, do you think it might make sense to put where all of the sensory information from your skin came in pretty close to where, so you're getting the sensory information from the body, but then you also exert that executive control over the body with the muscles. You think those two regions might make sense to be close to each other? And if your answer is yes, then you agree with Mother Nature. So they're actually right next door to each other. So we have the primary motor cortex right in the rear of the frontal lobe. And then we have that central sulcus, right? That dividing line between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. And just on the other side of the central sulcus, we have what's called the somatosensory cortex, which is really just your sense of touch, your tactile sensations. They come in to the somatosensory cortex, and they're right next door to where you have your voluntary control. Makes sense to me. If you feel something crawling on your leg, if you want that reflex to be quite fast, where you can jump back and move away or brush it away, you want those regions to be really close to each other because that we can speak to each other quickly, right? So the tactile information from your skin, your somatosensory cortex, right next door to your motor cortex on the other side of the central sulcus. Motor cortex is at the very back of the frontal lobe, somatosensory cortex at the very front of the parietal lobe. So the parietal lobe, let's talk about that for a little while. It's responsible for the integration of sensory information. So this includes your sense of touch, somatosensation. That's why it's called the somatosensory cortex. So things like temperature, pressure, and pain, all that's being integrated right there. We do have other regions that are kind of creeping in terms of your auditory cortex, which is largely in your temporal lobe, but we also have a little bit of crossover because of the integration, right? It's integrating that information in the parietal lobe. We also have a bit of taste and a little bit of vision. So your senses are all kind of creeping in that spot. But the main thing that it's responsible for is that sense of touch. It's only happening there. It doesn't happen anywhere else. All right, so let's just kind of look at this again because I really want to emphasize it. In here in the red or the pink, we have that primary motor cortex sitting right at the back of the frontal lobe. And we have this map. It's called a somatotopic map because it represents all the different regions of the body. And it corresponds pretty closely to the map that we have for sensation and that we have for muscle movement. If you think about it, a lot of the places where we have a lot of feeling, we also have a lot of dexterity. So case in point, in your mouth, in your fingers, or on your face, you have a lot of movement. So you have a lot of nerve endings in those places so that you can move muscles in tiny ways. And you also have a lot of feeling, right? You have a lot of feeling in your face. So then you have sensory nerves where you're getting information from the environment. So it makes sense that the maps that you have for feeling are pretty close to what you have for movement. So they look really similar to each other and they're right next door to each other in the brain. All right, so the somatotopic map, if you think about it, if you have more sensitivity then you're going to have more nerve endings, right? So if you have places like, in particular, if you think about your mouth or your nose or your hands, if you get bumped or bruised or scratched in some place like your mouth or your eye or your nose, how much more painful is that if it happens on your face or on your hands, as opposed to if you were to get cut like on your thigh or on your back? If it's just like a superficial wound, very just like fleshy, it's not nearly as painful in places like your leg or your back. But if it's someplace like on your hand or on your face, you have a lot of nerve endings there. So you have more sensitivity, which means there's going to be more real estate in your brain, in that somatosensory cortex, for that particular region. So real estate, or the more cortex that you have for that region, means you have more sensitivity. Same thing for motor movement, right? If you have more movement, like you can move your mouth around in a lot of different ways, you can move your fingers around in a lot of different ways, you're going to have more cortex in the primary motor cortex because you need more nerve endings to be able to carry out that level of complexity. Here we have what's called the sensory homunculus. So if you take that somatotopic map and then you make like a little man out of it, this is what it looks like. So basically really big hands, really big face, really big lips, really big tongue. Eyes are also pretty big because there is a lot of representation here. You have a lot of sensitivity in those particular regions. All right, last but not least, and actually we do have a little bit more coming after this, but you should already know this because we talked about this in the last chapter. The occipital lobe is responsible for processing visual information. In particular, the primary visual cortex is known as the V1. And remember, we had multiple studies that we talked about where it showed that the V1 is quite important for the conscious perception of visual information. Whenever we have damage there, we have cortical blindness. And also, if you disrupt signals going to the V1 region or the primary visual cortex, people will not consciously perceive whatever it is that's being transmitted via their other parts of their visual system. So the primary visual cortex receives information from the eyes, and it's secondarily processed there for depth, distance, location, and then identifying the objects in particular. Okay, here's last but not least in terms of the major regions or the major lobes of the cortex. So we have the right and left temporal lobes. So these are on either side of the head, and they're responsible for the processing of auditory information. Kind of makes sense because they're right next door to the ears. But fun fact, your right ear doesn't actually send its signals for processing to your right temporal lobe. There's this thing called contralateral processing. So the information that is received in your right ear is actually processed in your left temporal lobe, and vice versa. So there's a lot of this that happens with the body, but this is just one of the examples. Nonetheless, temporal lobe responsible for auditory information. It also processes some smell, some visual information, and its big one is it houses the hippocampi. I remember we talked about the hippocampi because the hippocampi are responsible for the processing of information of long-term memories. And the hippocampi are a part of what we call the limbic system, or it's kind of like considered a subcortical region because it's inside of the temporal lobe. So it's not sitting on top where the cortex is, but it's located in the interior. All right, so let's make sure that we kind of remember everything. This would be a little bit of review, and since we're recording this, I won't answer or ask all of the questions, but this is really just to show you the different main regions and make sure that we remember everything. Remember, the frontal lobe is responsible for a lot of executive processing, the control over information, behavior, emotions. In particular with behavior or muscle movement, we have that primary motor cortex that's right in the back. And then we have that central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. And right behind the central sulcus, we have that primary somatosensory cortex. Remember, that's where we process tactile information. Somatosensory means the sense of touch. and then the remainder of the parietal lobe. And that's where a lot of sensory integration happens. So the merging of information from all of your five senses to kind of make a complete picture where we understand exactly how those pieces fit together. In the very back, we have the occipital lobe responsible for the processing of visual information. And then on either side, we have the temporal lobes. It's hearing or auditory information. We also have smell, and we have a little bit of visual information that's processed there. So we have a little bit of sensory integration, but not quite as integral as the parietal lobe is for that particular portion of the program. And all of that is the cerebrum. That is the cortex. Those are the different lobes of the cortex. All right, we have some other things marked here, but we don't want to jump the gun on that. I kind of want to talk to you about things. So we're gonna talk about talking. So talking involves two different processes, right? So we actually have the formation of words or speech production, the actual act of talking. And then we have language processing, which is understanding words that are being heard, right? So those are two different parts of talking. Usually whenever you talk, you don't just talk to yourself, of course, unless you're recording a video for your class and nobody's listening. But for the most part, usually you're just you're engaging in conversation. That's why there's two pieces to the program. So if you had to think about this, right? If you think about what you understand about the different lobes, what lobe of the cortex do you think might be responsible for the production of speech? If we think about talking or making words happen with your body, that is a muscle movement, right? There's lots of activity happening here. And so it's voluntary. It's something that we're doing on purpose with our with voluntary control. So that should be something that gives you a little bit of a hint. And it would be, in fact, in the frontal lobe. So it's in the frontal lobe that occurs. And then we also have the process of hearing and understanding what we are receiving from others whenever they speak to us. So that language interpretation part, what do you think where that might occur and what we know already? And if you think about it, we already talked about auditory processing happening in a particular region. And if you remember, it's the temporal lobe, right? So the temporal lobe would also be what we're talking about. So, so it makes sense. If you guessed the frontal lobe for speech production, that is correct. We have Brocau's area. So you can kind of think about Broca, production, they kind of sound similar. So Brocau's area is responsible for speech production, and it is in the frontal lobe where we have all of that voluntary control, all that executive function. And then we have Wernicke's area, which is in the temporal lobe, and that's actually responsible for the understanding or interpretation of language. And that makes sense because that's where our auditory processing is occurring, is in the temporal lobe. So, so that's a little bit about speech production. Do you have any thoughts about this idea of being right versus left-brained? Some students would say that they think that that's a fallacy or some kind of an old way of thinking that's not actually true. And you're not wrong. You do use your whole brain. So if you've been told that before, that is accurate. But there is something to be said for left and right brain specific functions, in particular when it has to do with speech. So speech and language all happen in the left hemisphere. So your Brocau's area is on the left side of your frontal lobe. And then your Wernicke's area is in your left temporal lobe. So this is actually a case for lateralization or something specific that happens in one hemisphere of the brain and not the other. All right. So we all have likely heard of the idea of having these different parts of the brain, why they're important. I often end up skipping this, and I'm probably going to skip it now, but you're able to click on this if you want to see more information about how the right and the left brain talk to each other. You remember how I mentioned that your right ear actually processes uh, or the information that was received by your right ear actually is processed in your left temporal lobe, and vice versa. Information from your left ear is processed in your right temporal lobe. So the hemispheres have to speak to one another. And there's a super highway for that information. It's in red here. It's called the corpus callosum. So this is a large bundle of nerve fibers or neuron fibers. It's really the axons that are sending information to the other hemisphere for processing. And there is an example of a split brain patient that shows that they have difficulty. So there's another case for lateralization. There's like image processing that's a little bit better in the right brain, as opposed to more functional word processing that happens in the left brain. And whenever we have a split brain patient where this corpus callosum has been severed, you can see in the video that the patient will have difficulty being able to produce words when images are only shown or instructions are only given via one eye, right? Or where they can see information or hear information and it's only kind of delivered from one side of the body. They're not able to produce the information from the other side of the body. So it's actually quite interesting to watch. All right. So this is actually quite fun too. You can ask yourself to test yourself the different parts of the brain and what they're responsible for. And then after this, you can do the opposite. So now you're looking at the processes and what they do. And then you ask yourself what the names of these regions of the brain are. So it's good to test yourself on. Now we're going to look underneath the cortex. So remember we talked about the mammalian brain, which really has to do with what we call and know is the limbic system. So the limbic system is actually quite complex, and I am not going to ask you to remember all of the different parts of the limbic system. I'm really just going to ask you to remember four main pieces. There is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, also known as the hippocampi because there's two of them, one in each temporal lobe, and then the amygdala, which are actually structures at the very ends of the hippocampi. They're kind of almond shaped. And I just want you to know what those main things are for. And I guess I can go ahead and tell you briefly what they're for since I don't have that listed here. The thalamus is known as the relay station or the way station for all sensory information, with the exception of smell. So that's like the one that doesn't actually make a pit stop at the thalamus. Everything else does make a pit stop at the thalamus. So before it goes to the appropriate place in the cortex for processing, it stops at the thalamus and then it goes to the particular region where it's supposed to arrive for the final processing. The hypothalamus is actually known as kind of the hub or like the center point, the main area, the CEO, if you will, of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is your hormone system. So all hormones kind of start with the hypothalamus. So if you think about becoming an adolescent from starting off as a child, that involves the HPG axis or the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis with the release of sex hormones at the end stage. So the beginning of that actually starts at the hypothalamus. Then we have the hippocampi, which you should know by now is where we have the formation of long-term memories. And we have the amygdala. The amygdala are responsible, the fear, or a lot of times they're associated with fear, but it's really arousal. Anything that makes you aroused, it can be good or bad, but you kind of being in an aroused or excited state, that arises from the amygdala. And it kind of makes sense that it would be right next door to where long-term memories are stored, or how that gets stored into your cortex. Because if something's particularly arousing, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, you want to remember that, right? So if it's really good and you get excited about it, well, you would want to remember that because that could be good for your survival. Same thing if it's a bad thing. If it's a really bad thing, that could also be potentially really important for your survival. So also something that you would really want to remember. So Mother Nature houses the section of your brain that's responsible for arousal right next door to the structure that's responsible for the formation of long-term memories. All right. So remember that the prefrontal cortex is actually responsible for control over emotion. Although those lower regions, so the amygdala in particular, it has a lot more fibers or those axons sending signals to the prefrontal cortex than there is vice versa, right? So the neurons that originate in the prefrontal cortex and have axons extending back into the amygdala to exert executive control over those aren't nearly as strong or haven't been around as long as the ones coming from the amygdala going forward to the prefrontal cortex. But and that makes sense if you think about it. You really want to remember that stuff, right? In particular, anything that's arousing. If you think about whenever you have a bad day or if you have a really good day, either way, a lot of times you end up thinking about it a lot. And Mother Nature made it that way, right? You want to remember the really good stuff and the really bad stuff. You don't want to forget that stuff. You probably want to remember it. It's going to be good for you in the long term to usually recall. So while the prefrontal cortex is responsible for exerting executive control over those lower regions, there's a lot of more emphasis usually placed on those signals being sent forward. All right. We also have another, this is really just me showing you this. You're not going to be tested over it, but I wanted you to at least know there's a cortex underneath your cortex called the insular lobe. So it's kind of like a hidden cortex. I'll tell you the insula is in part responsible for how we perceive pain. So that's at least one thing that you can know about it. And it's kind of hidden underneath your cortex. We also have this thing called the cingulate gyrus. This is another part of the limbic system. It's a specific gyrus, kind of like we have that specific sulcus, the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. This is a specific gyrus, and it sits right on top of the corpus callosum. Remember, the corpus callosum is what allows communication between the hemispheres. The cingulate gyrus sits right on top of that corpus callosum, and it's a part of the limbic system, and it's also in part responsible for attention. So whenever you're paying attention to something, cingulate gyrus is involved in that process. This is just to give you an example so you can see into the brain where things are. And it's challenging to do because you have two lobes, so a lot of the things are mirror imaged on one another, but this is a side view. And hopefully you can kind of see in particular how the hippocampus, you can kind of see the front one, and then there's another mirror image kind of in the back. And the amygdala, that kind of like little bulbous part at the end. Remember, that's responsible for arousal. And there's one on both sides, right? There's one in your right temporal lobe, there's one in your left temporal lobe. They're inside of those lobes. And the hippocampus is kind of shrimp-like in its shape. And it's really the hippocampi because there's two of them, one in the temporal lobe on the right, one in the temporal lobe on the left. And then they kind of connect here. You can see that this little like C-shaped looking thing, that's that cingulate gyrus. And remember, there's not just one of them, there's two of them because it's on each side of the lobe. Inside, it's right above that corpus callosum on each, I should say each hemisphere has one kind of extending, and that kind of connects down into that hippocampus. And then in the middle, we kind of have what sits up on top of the brainstem. So right up on top of the brainstem, we have the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is responsible for the arrival of all sensory information from all your five senses, and I should say four senses because your olfactory sense or your sense of smell is an exception. But it goes there first, and then it goes to the cortex for the particular regions for them to be processed. And then just below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. Hypo really kind of means like lower or lesser or like below. So the hypothalamus sits right below the thalamus, and that's really responsible for hormones or your endocrine system. All right, and then also just, I guess, to show you this, the olfactory bulb, see how it connects right into the cingulate gyrus. So it's like this direct line. And I don't have a sense of smell, but from what I've heard from folks that can smell, they seem to be quite triggered by smells. Smells kind of bring up memories quite fast. And it's because it has this direct line right into the limbic system, and it doesn't make the stop at the thalamus. First, it goes right into that cingulate gyrus, which is then connected to the hippocampus, which can draw up memories really quickly. And the olfactory bulbs, there's actually two of them. They're almost like little antennae that kind of stick up underneath the frontal lobe, so you can kind of see them there. We kind of are like giant bugs in that way. All right, so here again, here's another image. This is showing you those parts of the limbic system inside. These parts on top, these are called ventricles. It's got a third ventricle, the lateral ventricle. We're not really covering that, but there are spaces inside of your brain called ventricles, and that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is kind of inside of the brain, and it allows for a number of different things, but mostly for getting rid of waste, because your brain has to process stuff. You've got live material with neurons in there, and the neurons actually produce some waste. So that's a part of that. It's also part of like the cushion. It makes things more cushiony if in fact you were to bang your head. But if we were to take all those internal parts and separate them out so we could look at them by themselves, we have that over here on the right part of the screen. And I've listed for you the things that, again, I want you to remember. So it's really just the four main things that I'm asking about. I'm telling you about more stuff, but the big ones that I really want you to remember: the thalamus, remember that sits right up on top of the brainstem. And then underneath the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. It's not actually identified here, but it's just underneath it. There's also some other stuff here to remind you that the limbic system is complex, and I'm not asking you to remember everything. And then we've got the amygdala. Remember, that's the center where we have the arousal process. And then just behind the amygdala would be where the hippocampus or hippocampi are on both sides. And that's the area responsible for the formation of long-term memories. Here's another view. So this is actually from the front, looking at it's called the rostral view, or from the face. So if we're looking at the brain from the front, then we have these hippocampi that are kind of staring at us with the amygdala right there on top. And then you can see the olfactory bulb that's connected right to that cingulate gyrus and directly to the amygdala, which are both connected to the hippocampus and responsible for drawing up not just the formation of long-term memories, but for pulling out or recalling memories. And then underneath this, you can kind of see in the back, we would have the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and that's what's sitting on top of the brainstem. So that's that front view, and then this is the side view. So if you were to slice the brain down the middle and look at it from the side, you can see how right here we've got the hypothalamus. So the thalamus is sitting right on top of it. And then next to it, we've got inside of the lobe, right inside of the left temporal lobe, I guess from this side, would be the amygdala and the hippocampus. So these are just different views so that you can kind of orient yourself to where things are. To recap, remember the forebrain. This is from the developmental perspective. It includes the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the cortex. It also includes parts of the limbic system, which are the thalamus and the hypothalamus. If you want the bio word for it, it's the diencephalon. And remember the midbrain. We've almost forgotten about the midbrain, right? It's such a tiny, itty bitty part of the brain. It does have some responsibilities, but I'm not really holding you accountable for that information right now. But it's this, the midbrain is this tiny little part right there. It's the green part, the mesencephalon, really, really tiny. And then the hindbrain really includes the rest of the brainstem, the pons and the medulla oblongata, and then the cerebellum, which is that baby brain in the back. All right. In terms of reading the brain, we have some different imaging techniques. The first one is really good for some stuff. And all of these, they have different, like they have pros and cons. And there are more actually that are even listed here, but these are a good place to start. So the first one's called an EEG, also known as an electroencephalogram, or if you're talking about the practice of it, it's called electroencephalography. because that's the practice. If you're talking about the procedure, it's an electroencephalogram. So you can see in the image here, we have a cap that's placed on a participant or a patient's head, and these electrodes have to transmit, and they're not really transmitting to the brain, they're reading the signal off of the brain, but transmission is required regardless, because remember we talked about when neurons fire, it's an electrical process. We have the exchange of ions that's happening in order for that to occur. So when neurons are firing, which has happened all the time, and it never stops, that can be read by the EEG. And we need a little bit of solution. So the electrodes are there to read, but we need a little bit of solution for the conductivity. And it's basically reading those brain waves and allowing the researcher or the doctor to see what's happening. And there are specific brain waves that are associated with different things. We talked about beta waves and being associated with visual processing. Theta waves are also associated with creativity. So those are a couple that you can kind of hold on to. I'm not holding you accountable for that. It just oftentimes students will ask. So I'm giving you a little bit of information to go off of. So in terms of like the good things about EEG, they're really good with what's called temporal resolution, or in terms of time, we can get like microseconds of information, what's happening moment to moment, microsecond by microsecond. So you can see that on this graph, we have seconds here, and it's actually broken down into what's occurring like second by second, moment by moment. We know exactly what's occurring. And we can also see a little bit about where it's occurring. So the color of the line is associated with where it's happening on the skull, but that's a pretty, not very detailed version of the brain, and it's from the top. So we're looking at from the top of the brain, the little peak there on top, that's supposed to be the nose. So that's the like the rostral part of the front of the face. And then we have the ears on either side. So we can kind of generally see that there's frontal lobe activity happening at 8 seconds and 15 seconds, right? There's kind of more red occurring there. And then it kind of dissipates around 22 seconds and then comes back again around 29 seconds. But it's not real specific. It doesn't give us a tremendous amount of detail in terms of spatial resolution or spatial acuity. So really great for temporal resolution, not good for spatial resolution. Next up, we have some better information about functionality. So there are two main ones that we'll talk about here. There's the PET and the fMRI. The PET is positron emission topography. And what they do is they actually inject radioactive substance into the bloodstream and watch as it circulates through the brain. And wherever that's occurring, then we understand that there's more activity. So metabolism of that radioactive substance is demonstrating more activity. And so here you can kind of see a little bit more about where things are happening, right? Where is the activity? So that it's a little bit more granular than what we saw before, right? We can see a little bit more specificity about what's happening as opposed to what we just saw in the previous image. Even better than that, we have fMRI. So this actually measures naturally occurring oxygen and the consumption of that oxygen. So it's really fantastic in terms of being able to see where things are happening. So check out that image. That's really great, right? We can see all of the folds, the gyri and the sulci and the cortex. We can see inside of the brain. We're actually looking at the corpus callosum there. We're looking at the cingulate gyrus. We're looking at the cerebellum. We're looking at the brainstem. There's a tremendous amount of clarity there. So it's really fantastic in terms of the visual resolution, right? We can see a lot of spatial resolution. We know where things are occurring. Really, really great for that, but not really fantastic for temporal resolution. So we don't know when it's occurring as well, just that it is occurring. So drawback on that one. In terms of structure, so I like talking about function versus structure. That was one of the main topics we talked about in the history of psychology. Very different because at that juncture, they were really trying to look at consciousness and just kind of measuring, mental activity, as opposed to looking at brain activity. It was much more theoretical at that time. Now we're really looking at what is the brain doing as opposed to what the mind is doing, which is a more fuzzy concept. But these aren't quite as important usually for psychology. This is usually more whenever we're looking at structural abnormalities. So if people have something like a tumor in their brain, or remember we talked about those ventricles, the spaces where the cerebrospinal fluid is allowed to flow, sometimes they'll be quite large, or there'll be like atrophy where parts of the brain will shrink. Um, Things like that, structural changes. That's whenever the CAT scan and a regular MRI are actually useful. So we're going to put it all together now and talk about diffuse optical imaging. This is actually the best, right? So this is actually shining infrared light into the brain, and the light properties actually change as they pass through oxygenated blood and active neurons. And what's really fantastic about this, it's also very expensive, and not a lot of universities are going to have them, but it offers great temporal resolution and spatial resolution. So we get the best of both worlds. So it really is kind of the bee's knees, if you would. All right, so that really concludes what I have to offer you guys today. I'll be posting this for you to leave comments on or ask questions about. I do anticipate that you will have seen this and that we will be able to use the information presented in lecture so that we can have a good day on Wednesday and you guys are able to engage in a bit of a game. So we're hoping to have a game and a little bit of discussion afterwards, in light of the fact that you guys have watched this. I also would really love if you came to class with any particular questions. But remember that we're really just trying to make sure that you get this information down. So if you want me to review information, I'm happy to do that. But we don't really want to delve in too deep into like something in particular, like, can you tell me about the brain in regards to a particular condition, or, what happens to an addict, or those type of things, only because that's not going to usually be that helpful at this juncture. Right now, I just really want you to remember the different parts of the brain, the different perspectives, the developmental, the evolutionary perspective, those two, and then the different regions and the different functions. So so make sure that you kind of keep your questions in terms of reviewing information specific. All right, and then we'll play a game and we'll go do some review, and then I'll be introducing your research projects because I want you to work on that next week. So I look forward to seeing you guys on Wednesday, and if you have questions, let me know. All right, just 1 second while I stop this here. All right, bye-bye.